The noon sun blazed over Willow Bend, that dusty little town wedged between two ridges and a river that ran dry half the year. The air shimmered with heat, and the streets smelled of horses, sweat, and new beginnings. It was Bride Day, a strange kind of celebration that had become common in the territories. The train from the east had just arrived, and with it, a handful of women, each clutching a small bag, each carrying a bigger dream. Men gathered along the main street, boots dusty, hats in hand, pretending not to look too eager. They'd been told this shipment, some called it that, crude as it sounded, was for the settlers' good. Families, the preacher had said, were the backbone of civilization, but truth be told, most men were just lonely. At the center of it all stood Sheriff Clay Hargrove, tall and broad, his badge glinting like the sun. He leaned against the hitching post, surveying the crowd with the patience of a man who'd seen every kind of trouble cross his town. Beside him, a man of quieter bearing, Luke Carver, a rancher in his early 30s with a worn brown hat pulled low and a face that carried more silence than smiles. Clay clapped Luke on the shoulder. "Well, Carver," he said, half grinning, "there they are. Finest batch yet. Take your pick." Luke didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the women, some young and hopeful, some older and tired. A few smiled nervously when they caught him looking, not because they knew him, but because a man like Luke Carver had a name that carried weight. He owned one of the biggest spreads west of town, worked his own land, didn't drink, didn't gamble, and didn't chase women. The kind of man mothers pointed out to their daughters, if only he weren't still half married to the memory of his late wife. Clay's grin faded when Luke didn't move. "You've been alone near 3 years now," the sheriff went on. "No man can raise 2 girls and run a ranch without help forever. You need a woman's touch out there," Luke finally spoke, voice low and steady. "I got help. And my girls don't need a stranger calling herself Ma," the sheriff sighed. "It ain't about replacing her, Luke. It's about keeping things together." "You can't do it all alone." Luke's gaze drifted past the sheriff toward the platform where the women stood in a nervous line. One wore a red bonnet, smiling too wide. Another clutched a Bible, lips moving in silent prayer. A third stood tall and proud, chin high, as if daring anyone to look down on her. But Luke didn't see them. He saw only the past. He remembered a voice softer than spring rain, laughter floating across the prairie, the way his wife, Mary, used to call him in for supper with their girls on her hip. He remembered the fever that took her one night, sudden, merciless, and final. Since then, his home had been quiet. "Too quiet?" "Luke," Clay said again, gentler this time. "You're not choosing for yourself. You're choosing for them girls. Lila and Rose need someone to teach them things a man can't." Luke's jaw tightened. "They need their mother, and she's gone." For a long moment, the two men just stood there, the sheriff squinting at him, the wind whispering through the dry grass beyond town. Then Clay let out a long breath and muttered, "Stubborn fool." Luke didn't argue. He simply tipped his hat, turned toward his horse, and walked away from the line of women, from the town's curious eyes, from the life everyone thought he ought to have. But as he passed by the general store, 2 small faces peeked out from behind the wagon, his daughters, waiting patiently, sunburnt cheeks and braids messy from the ride. They grinned when they saw him, and he felt the familiar ache of love and loss all tangled together. "Did you find her, Papa?" little Rose asked. Luke smiled faintly. "Not today, sweetheart." And as he lifted them onto the wagon seat, neither of them noticed the quiet woman standing apart from the others, watching them go with eyes that would soon change all their lives. The wagon wheels creaked as Luke Carver steered his team down the winding trail out of Willow Bend. The noise of the town faded behind. Him, the laughter, the talk, the pitying looks. Only the slow rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind through sagebrush followed him now. His 2 girls sat close beside him on the seat. Lila, the older by 10 minutes, stared straight ahead like her father did, trying to copy his quiet strength. Rose, softer and smaller, leaned her head against his arm and hummed a tune she barely remembered, something their mother used to sing when nights were gentle and the lamps were still burning. Luke kept his eyes on the road. The sheriff's words clung to him like burrs. You can't do it all alone. Maybe Clay was right, but Luke had learned the hard way that need could make a man desperate, and desperate men made bad choices. He'd seen too many neighbors rush into second marriages only to fill their homes with bitterness instead of comfort. He'd rather live with the emptiness he knew than invite in trouble he couldn't foresee. The ranch came into view as the trail leveled out, a wide stretch of grassland dotted with cattle and fences that needed mending. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, thin and straight against the afternoon sky. Luke's ranch hand, old Ben, waved from the corral where he was breaking a young colt. Luke pulled the reins and jumped down, helping the girls from the wagon. "Go wash up," he said softly. "We'll eat soon." They scampered toward the house, skirts flapping, laughter echoing against the barn walls. For a moment, that sound, bright and fleeting, made Luke's heart ease. But then he looked around at all the work waiting for him. Fences sagging, tools rusting, the barn roof missing a few shingles the last windstorm had stolen. It was too much for one man, he knew it. Still, he couldn't bear the thought of another woman in Mary's place. Old Ben came up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Heard the sheriff brought in a batch of ladies," he said, half smiling. "Reckon he tried to marry you off again?" Luke grunted. "He tried. And?" "I said no," Ben chuckled. "Didn't expect any different." Then quieter. "You sure that's fair to them little girls? They miss their ma something fierce." Luke took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and looked toward the house where two small shadows moved behind the curtain. "I miss her too," he said simply. They stood there a while in silence, the kind that didn't need words. The sky stretched wide and gold above them, the kind of sky that promised both hope and hardship. Luke turned toward the pasture, needing something to do, something to mend or fix or lift, anything to drown the ache that lived just beneath his ribs. By sundown, the girls came out carrying tin plates. "Papa," said Lila, "Miss June at the Mercantile says the new ladies can cook real fancy. Biscuits with butter and jam." Luke smiled faintly. "We've got our own biscuits, don't we?" "They're hard," Rose muttered. "Like rocks," he laughed then, a rare sound, deep and warm. "Then tomorrow we'll try making them softer." The girls nodded, satisfied, and skipped back inside. But when Luke looked toward the darkening horizon, a thought slipped in, quiet and unwelcome. Maybe Clay was right. Maybe his girls did need more than he could give. Still, he told himself, he'd manage. He always did. Love wasn't something you just replaced. And yet, far off in town, under the fading light, a woman with tired eyes and a limp in her step was thinking of the quiet man who hadn't chosen anyone, and wondering why his two little girls had looked at her so intently before. They rode away. The winds of Willow Bend were already turning, though Luke Carver didn't know it yet. The next morning dawned soft and golden over the Carver ranch. Mist hung over the pastures, and the cattle moved slow through the dew. Inside the house, Lila and Rose were already awake, whispering to each other across their shared bed. "Papa didn't like any of the ladies," Rose said, pulling her blanket to her chin. Lila, the steadier one, frowned thoughtfully. Maybe he didn't look hard enough. They both knew what the sheriff's event had been about, even if no one said it plainly. Everyone in Willow Bend had been talking about Bride Day for weeks. The chance for the lonely men of the territory to find wives brought in from back east. The girls had heard the whispers, seen the hopeful faces, and though they missed their mother terribly, they weren't blind to their father's loneliness. Rose sat up, eyes shining. "Did you see her? The lady in the brown dress, standing all by herself near the train?" Lila nodded slowly. "She looked nice." She smiled at us, Rose said in a small, dreamy voice. "Like she knew us already." The older twin turned her gaze toward the window, where sunlight spilled across the wooden floorboards. Papa didn't even notice her. Downstairs, Luke was already at the table, coffee steaming, papers spread before him, bills, feed orders, repair lists. He looked up when the girls came running in, cheeks flushed from excitement. "Morning, Papa," Rose chirped. "Morning," he said, managing a faint smile. "Eat your porridge before it gets cold." They obeyed, though their chatter didn't stop. Between spoonfuls, Rose asked, "Will we go back to town today?" Luke raised an eyebrow. "Town? Didn't we just come from there?" "Yes, but we didn't get to say goodbye," she said quickly. "Goodbye to who?" Rose looked at her sister, then whispered, "That lady." "What lady?" Luke asked, genuinely puzzled. "The one in the brown dress," Lila explained. "She wasn't with the others. She looked lonely." Luke frowned slightly, setting down his cup. He remembered glimpsing a woman at the edge of the crowd yesterday. Plain dress, quiet eyes, standing apart as if she didn't belong. He hadn't thought twice about her. "She's not one of the brides," he said finally. "She just came on the same train." "But she looked kind," Rose insisted. "She smiled at us." Luke sighed. "Lots of people smile at you, Rosie. That doesn't mean—" "She's the one, Papa," Lila said suddenly, her tone so sure it made him pause. "Mama would like her." The words hit him like a stone dropped in still water, rippling through the quiet morning. For a long moment, Luke couldn't speak. He looked at his daughters, their serious faces, their small hands holding spoons too big for them, and something in his chest ached. He wanted to tell them they were wrong, that such things couldn't be chosen with a glance or a whisper, but instead, he just nodded slowly and said, "Eat your breakfast." After they finished, he went out to the barn, hoping the sound of work would drown the memory of those words. Mama would like her. But as he hitched the horses and checked the tack, the image of that woman in the brown dress returned. Dust on her hem, eyes full of quiet strength. She hadn't looked like the others. She hadn't seemed to be waiting for anyone. That evening, when Luke rode into town to pick up supplies, he saw her again. She was sitting outside the livery stable, mending a tear in her skirt, her hands rough and steady. No one stood near her. No one spoke to her. For a moment, Luke hesitated, watching her from across the street. Then he turned away. But from the upstairs window of the mercantile, two little faces peered down, the twins, who'd secretly begged old Ben to bring them along for the ride. Rose whispered, "Papa, that's her." And Lila, solemn as a preacher, said, "I told you. Mama would like her." Clara Wren arrived in Willow Bend with little more than a small canvas bag, a threadbare shawl, and a limp that made every mile westward feel longer than the last. The train had carried her through dust storms and silence, across plains where only wind and regret seemed to live. She had watched the world blur past her window, each mile taking her farther from what she'd lost, and yet no closer to where she belonged. When the train hissed into Willow Bend, the other women stepped off in pairs or small groups, chattering softly, smoothing their skirts, clutching letters from the men who'd written them. Each woman had someone waiting. Clara had no one. She stood quietly beside the platform, her heart tight with the same question that had followed her across 3 states. Where do I fit now? The station master looked at her with mild curiosity when she asked about work. "Work?" he repeated. "You mean house help?" "Yes, sir. Or kitchen help, maybe laundry," she said, keeping her voice even. "I can cook and sew, and I'm not afraid of long days." He frowned, scratching his chin. "You might ask at the boarding house, though they don't take in cripples." The word hit her like a slap, though his tone was casual. She thanked him anyway and walked off with what little dignity she could keep. The boarding house did turn her away, kindly enough. "No vacancies," the matron said, though Clara could see the empty bed through the door. The saloon keeper laughed outright when she asked for dishwashing work. "Lady, you'd break your neck on that leg in the first hour." By dusk, she had found herself near the edge of town, sitting on an upturned crate beside the livery. She unwrapped a piece of stale bread from her pocket, eating it slowly while the sun bled gold and crimson across the sky. That was when she saw them. 2 little girls peeking from behind a wagon, watching her with curious eyes. She smiled, gentle and hesitant, and to her surprise, they smiled back. The younger one even waved before a man's voice called them away. Clara's gaze followed as the man, broad-shouldered, quiet, with the kind of strength that didn't need boasting, lifted the girls into his wagon. There was something about the way he moved, careful and patient, that stirred an ache in her chest. A family, she thought. Or what was left of one. She didn't know his name then, nor that his daughters had already spoken of her in whispers. She only knew that for the first time in weeks, someone had looked at her, really looked, and not turned away in disgust or pity. When night came, Clara found shelter behind the livery barn, rolling her shawl into a pillow. Her leg throbbed, and the chill bit through her dress. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. She thought instead of the past she'd run from, a small county hospital where fevered souls had come in faster than she could tend them, the smell of disinfectant and death, the man who'd promised her a home after, but never kept his word. By the time she realized she was alone in the world, she had already lost everything that tethered her. Now, Willow Bend was supposed to be a fresh start, but the town had no room for broken people, not even the quiet kind. As the stars scattered above her, Clara whispered to herself, "Tomorrow I'll try again." And though she didn't know it yet, the quiet rancher who'd ridden away from town that morning would soon come looking for her. The man whose daughters had already chosen her heart before he even knew her name. The next Saturday, the town square of Willow Bend was livelier than usual. A fiddler played outside the saloon, horses stomped dust into the air, and gossip swirled like wind through cottonwood leaves. Sheriff Clay Hargrove stood on the boardwalk outside his office, boots planted wide, arms folded. He'd seen every kind of fool come through town, drifters, outlaws, dreamers, but none as stubborn as his friend Luke Carver. "You sure about this?" he asked, watching Luke dismount across the street. Luke tied his horse and nodded once. "My girls insisted," Clay chuckled under his breath. "Your girls? Lord help me, Carver, you're letting 2 9-year-olds run your life." "They've got a better sense of people than most grown men I know," Luke said. The sheriff raised a brow. "And just who do they have their eyes on?" Luke hesitated, glancing toward the far end of the platform where a woman stood with a small satchel clutched to her chest. Clara Wren. She looked out of place again, too humble for the saloon crowd, too quiet for the brides still hoping for husbands. She'd cleaned up some since last week, though her dress was still plain, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. Her limp was more noticeable in the daylight. Clay followed Luke's gaze and groaned. No, don't tell me it's her." Luke said nothing. "Carver, she's not one of the brides," the sheriff said, lowering his voice. "She's got no papers, no arrangements. She ain't on any list." Luke met his eyes calmly. "I know." Clay threw up a hand. "Then what in blazes are you thinking?" Luke's jaw tightened. "I'm thinking my girls pointed at her like they'd found a ghost from heaven. I'm thinking she looked at them with kindness, not calculation. And I'm thinking that's more than I can say for half the folks in this town." For a moment, Clay didn't speak. He'd known Luke long enough to recognize that tone, the quiet finality that came when the man had already decided something in his bones. Still, he had to try. "Luke," he said, softer now, "I know what losing Mary did to you. You've been half here and half gone ever since. But this ain't the way to fill the hole." Luke's eyes shifted toward his daughters, standing by the wagon, their small hands intertwined, faces bright with hope. "Maybe it's not about me, Clay. Maybe it's about giving them back what they've missed." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his neck. "You don't even know her name." "Clara Wren," Luke said quietly. That stopped him cold. "You already asked?" "Last night. She's been sleeping behind the livery. I brought her some bread and coffee." "She didn't ask for a thing," Clay blinked. "You fed her?" Luke nodded once. "She's decent. Just unlucky." "Well, hell," Clay muttered, glancing around as the townsfolk started to notice the little scene building. "You're about to stir up talk, you know that? Every gossip in Willow Bend will be wagging her tongue before sundown." Luke shrugged. "Let 'em talk." Across the street, Clara saw the 2 men watching her. She froze, uncertain whether to flee or stay. The memory of humiliation was still fresh, the jeers when she'd asked for work, the looks of pity. But when she saw the 2 girls near the wagon, smiling and waving, something softened in her chest. Then Luke began walking toward her. Every sound in the square seemed to fade. The fiddler's tune, the chatter, even the horse's snorts. All eyes turned to the quiet rancher striding through the dust toward the woman no one else had wanted. Clay groaned under his breath, muttering, "Lord, he's really gonna do it." And when Luke reached Clara, he removed his hat, voice low but steady. "Miss Wren," he said, "my name's Luke Carver. My daughters think the world of you, and I reckon I'd like to get to know you better." Her eyes widened, disbelief flickering into something softer, something dangerously close to hope. Behind him, the sheriff crossed his arms and shook his head, muttering, "You damn fool, Carver. You just threw half the town into a fit." But even as he said it, Clay couldn't quite hide his smile, because for the first time in 3 years, he saw life in Luke's eyes again. Dust swirled in slow eddies around the town square as Luke Carver stood facing Clara Wren. The air seemed to still, as if even the wind paused to listen. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Clara clutched her small satchel tighter against her chest, unsure whether to bow, curtsy, or run. Around them, curious eyes watched from porches and store windows. Willow Bend had not seen this kind of spectacle in years. Luke's voice was steady, but quiet. "Miss Wren, my name's Luke Carver. I live a few miles west of town. My girls, they saw you last week. Been talking about you ever since." Her throat went dry. "About me?" He nodded, glancing toward his daughters. Lila and Rose stood by the wagon, faces flushed with excitement, waving shyly. "They seem to think you're, well, someone we ought to know," Luke continued. "I don't rightly understand why, but I've learned not to doubt them." Clara's eyes darted toward the sheriff, who was still standing by his office, arms crossed and face torn between disbelief and amusement. "Mr. Carver," she said hesitantly, "I believe there's been a mistake. I'm not a bride," he finished for her. "I know," the word surprised her. "Then why—" Luke took a slow breath, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his eyes. "Because I reckon what a man needs ain't always what he planned for. My girls lost their mother young. They've had no woman to look after them, no softness in their days. You looked at them with kindness when no one else did." Clara blinked, speechless. Around them, the whispers began to rise. "He's choosing her? The crippled one? The one with no papers? Has Carver gone mad?" The sheriff stepped forward then, boots creaking on the wood. "Now hold on, Luke, let's be reasonable. You can't just pick any woman in town and say she's yours. There's law and decency even out here." Luke turned to him, calm but firm. "Clay, you said I could choose any woman I wanted. You remember?" Clay's mouth opened, then shut again. "I didn't mean it literally." The crowd chuckled, nervous and eager for scandal. Luke ignored them all, turning back to Clara. "Miss Wren, I'm not asking for a favor or charity. I've got work, a home, and 2 little girls who deserve someone to care for them. I don't offer fancy words, but I can promise you safety, food, and respect." The world seemed to tilt under her feet. She had spent months being turned away, told she was too poor, too plain, too broken. Now this man, this stranger, was offering her not just shelter but a place to belong. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me?" Luke hesitated, eyes softening. "Because when I looked at you, I saw someone who's known loss and didn't let it turn her bitter." Something fragile cracked inside her chest. Clay rubbed his forehead. "Luke, you're making a mistake." "Maybe," Luke said simply, "but it's mine to make." He turned back to Clara. "If you'd rather not, I'll walk away right now and trouble you no more. But if you'll have me and my girls, we'll see what kind of life we can build from what's left." For a long, trembling moment, Clara just stood there. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Then quietly she said, "All right." It wasn't loud. It wasn't certain. But it was enough. Lila and Rose squealed with joy, running toward her, their small arms wrapping around her skirt. Clara froze, then knelt awkwardly to return their embrace. For the first time in years, she felt warmth, not from the sun, but from belonging. The sheriff exhaled, muttering, "Lord above, Carver, you've done it now." Luke smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Reckon I have." And so, beneath the watchful eyes of a gossiping town and a blazing western sun, A man still grieving, a woman with nowhere left to go. And two little girls hungry for love took the first step towards something none of them fully understood, something that would soon test every scar they carried. The wedding took place the very next morning, if it could be called that. There were no flowers, no white dress, no music. Just the echo of boots on wooden floors and the scratch of a pen signing a name that would change two lives forever. Sheriff Clay Hargrove stood at the front of his office, arms crossed, watching with a mix of disbelief and reluctant fondness. "Fastest wedding I've ever seen," he muttered. "A man can't even drink his morning coffee before you've gone and tied yourself up, Carver." Luke didn't answer. He stood tall, freshly shaven, hat in his hands. His girls, Lila and Rose, stood beside him in their Sunday dresses, faces glowing with excitement. They had spent the night whispering and giggling in bed, too happy to sleep. And there, on the other side of the sheriff's desk, stood Clara Wren, nervous, pale, and still uncertain if any of this was real. She wore the same brown dress, though she'd brushed out her hair and braided it neatly. Her limp made her stand unevenly, but her posture was straight, her chin high. Clay cleared his throat. "Well, seeing as there's no preacher in town this week, I reckon I'll do. By the power vested in me by the county of Pondera and the state of Montana Territory," he paused, looking between them. "You sure about this, Clara?" Her fingers tightened around the hem of her shawl. She looked at Luke, at his steady eyes, his weathered hands, the quiet strength in him, and she nodded once. "Yes, Sheriff, I'm sure," Clay sighed. "Then I pronounce you man and wife." There was no applause, no cheers, just the sound of the sheriff setting down his pen and muttering, "God help you both." Lila and Rose didn't care. They ran to Clara, wrapping their arms around her waist, squealing, "Mama! We have a mama!" Clara's breath caught. For a moment she couldn't move. The word mama was a shock to her system, but when she looked down into those two bright faces, something broke open inside her. She knelt slowly and hugged them both, tears blurring her vision. Luke stood silent behind her, watching. His throat tightened at the sight, the memory of Mary flickering like a ghost in the corner of his heart. For the first time, he didn't look away. By noon, they rode out of town together. The gossip trailed behind them like dust on the wind, some saying the rancher had lost his mind, others whispering that maybe, just maybe, the Lord had a strange way of mending the broken. The Carver Ranch came into view under a wide blue sky. The girls raced ahead to show Clara everything, the corral, the barn, the creek where wildflowers grew. "This is home," Lila said proudly. Clara smiled faintly. "It's beautiful." Inside she found the house simple but clean. Every surface bore the mark of hard work and quiet grief. There was a faded photograph of a smiling woman, Mary Carver, on the mantel, beside two tiny carved horses. Luke noticed her looking. "My wife," he said quietly. "She passed 3 years ago." Clara bowed her head. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "You don't need to replace her. Just be kind to the girls. That's all I ask." Something in his voice, gentle but guarded, told her that this arrangement wasn't about love, not yet. It was about survival. Two lonely souls making the best of what life had left them. That night, Clara lay awake in the small room Luke had given her at the end of the hall. She could hear the house settling, the whisper of wind through the rafters, the soft murmur of the twins' laughter in their sleep. It wasn't the home she'd dreamed of. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. And as she closed her eyes, she thought, maybe belonging doesn't come all at once. Maybe it starts like this, quiet and uncertain, but real. Down the hall, Luke sat by the dying fire, staring into the flames. He didn't know if he'd done the right thing. But when he heard Clara's soft footsteps overhead and his girl's peaceful breathing nearby, the house felt less empty than it had in a long, long time. Winter had settled over the Carver Ranch, blanketing the pastures in snow and muffling the world outside. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of burning pine and stew through the modest home. Inside, Clara Wren moved quietly, tending the fire while the twins played with wooden blocks, their laughter bright and innocent against the soft crackle of the hearth. Luke watched from his chair, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee as Clara moved about the kitchen. Something about the way she worked, efficient, gentle, mindful of the small details, made the house feel more like a home than it had since Mary's passing. And yet, Luke sensed a distance in her, a shadow that lingered behind her careful smiles. It was on a quiet afternoon, while repairing a fence near the creek, that Luke first discovered the truth. Clara had accompanied the girls to gather firewood, her limp causing her to slow, but her determination never faltering. The girls chattered excitedly, oblivious to the sudden tension in Luke's voice as he called, "Clara!" "Wait!" She turned, startled. In his hand, he held a small locket, tarnished and delicate, almost buried beneath the dust of the old barn. He opened it with careful fingers, revealing a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, Mary Carver. Clara froze, a pale blush coloring her cheeks. I didn't mean for you to find that," she murmured. Luke's gaze softened. "Where'd you get this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I was with her. When the fever swept through the county hospital, she was dying. I tried to help. I stayed by her side. I did everything I could, but she didn't make it." The words hung in the air, heavy as the snow-laden branches around them. Luke's hands fell to his sides. For a long moment, neither moved. I never told anyone," Clara continued, tears brimming. "Not even you. I thought you'd blame me. I thought you'd hate me for failing her." Luke shook his head slowly. "Clara, I've spent 3 years blaming the world for taking her from me. I never blamed anyone else, least of all the woman who cared enough to stay by her side." The girls ran toward them, tugging at Clara's hands. "Papa, look what we found!" Lila shouted, brandishing a stick shaped like a sword. Luke knelt, ruffling their hair. "Girls, go play. This is private business for a moment." Clara swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the locket. "I thought, if you knew, you'd never want me here. Not with your girls, not in your life." Luke stood slowly, stepping closer. The cold wind whipped at his coat, but his eyes were warm, steady. "Clara, look at me. You were honest where others would have run. You stayed. You cared for my girls. You helped them laugh again. That matters more than any past mistake." She stared at him, stunned, the years of guilt and self-doubt threatening to break her composure. I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You do," Luke said firmly. "Because it's not about deserving. It's about what you've done. Being here, being kind, being brave. That's enough." For the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to breathe. The cold seemed to lift slightly, the snow glittering in the sunlight as if blessing their small revelation. Luke took her hand gently, the gesture quiet but full of meaning. The girls, sensing the shift, ran back to them, dragging their mother-to-be into their circle of warmth. Laughter replaced the tension, the house filling with a sound Luke hadn't heard in far too long. And in that moment, with the locket safely tucked away and the truth finally shared, the shadows of the past began to fade. Clara's secret no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a bridge, connecting her to a family that had already, in a way, chosen her. Luke watched her with new understanding, the weight of grief finally loosening, replaced by something fragile but undeniable: trust, and perhaps the first glimmer of love. The winter sky darkened suddenly, a heavy gray curtain rolling across the prairie. Luke Carver's ranch, usually quiet and peaceful, became a place of tension as the first flakes of snow swirled violently against the fences. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying ice and grit that cut through coats and skin. Inside the house, Clara Wren hurried to secure the windows, her limp making each step slower than she wanted. Lila and Rose huddled near the fire, their small hands grasping hers. "Papa!" Lila called. "Are the cows okay?" Luke, already in his coat, stood by the door, boots crunching in the snow. "We'll check," he said, though his voice carried the uncertainty of a man who had weathered many storms, but not one like this. The storm hit fast. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the snow piling unevenly across the yard and corral. Cattle bellowed in panic, some straying toward the fences, others freezing in place, terrified by the wind. Luke barked orders to old Ben, but even the seasoned ranch hand was struggling against the elements. Then came the scream. "Papa! Lila! Rose!" Clara's voice cut through the wind. Luke's heart dropped. He saw the girls trapped near the barn, their small forms shivering against the gusts. The barn doors partially closed, but swinging wildly in the storm. Without thinking, Clara pushed past Luke. Her leg protested. Pain stabbing with every step, but she didn't slow. She reached the barn first, scooping the girls into her arms and holding them close. Snow whipped her hair into her face, but she ignored it, murmuring reassurances that were stronger than she felt. Luke followed, shouting her name, but he knew there was no stopping her. She moved with a determination that came from sheer instinct and love, shielding the girls from the storm as best she could. When the barn door swung shut again, she forced it open with her shoulder, bracing against the wind, finally leading the children to safety inside. Once inside, the three huddled together as Luke arrived, breathless and wide-eyed. He looked at Clara, sweat and snow on her brow, bruises forming where the storm had battered her, her hands raw from gripping the wood, and something in him shifted. You saved them," he said, voice tight. Clara shook her head, refusing the praise. "They're just kids." "I couldn't let anything happen to them." Luke's gaze softened. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had glimpsed the first time she smiled at his daughters. He saw courage, loyalty, and strength, qualities far rarer than beauty or wealth in the harsh life of the frontier. As the storm raged outside, he realized how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't just a kind heart. She was their protector, their anchor, and perhaps one day the one he could trust with his own heart. The girls giggled quietly, exhausted but exhilarated, curling into her lap. "Mama's amazing," Rose whispered. Lila nodded fiercely, her tiny fists pounding lightly against Clara's arm in joy. Luke exhaled, long and slow, and sat beside them. "You're right," he murmured. "She's incredible." In that small, fire-lit barn, with snow beating relentlessly against the walls and wind screaming across the fields, something deeper shifted between them. Clara's bravery had forced Luke to face what he had been running from for years, his fear of losing those he loved, and the undeniable truth that he had already begun to love the woman standing beside him. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside his heart, wild, overwhelming, yet cleansing. By the time it began to subside, the barn no longer felt like a place of peril. It felt like a refuge. Luke finally reached for Clara's hand, gripping it gently but firmly. She looked at him, startled but not pulling away. The understanding passed silently between them. Trust had been earned in snow, fear, and courage. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, dusting the world with silver, Luke realized that what had begun as a marriage of necessity was beginning to grow into something far stronger, something rooted in respect, bravery, and the tender stirrings of love. Spring had returned to the Carver Ranch, soft and fragrant. The snow was gone, replaced by the tender green of new grass and wildflowers nodding in the breeze. The air was alive with birdsong, the distant lowing of cattle, and the gentle laughter of Lila and Rose chasing each other through the pastures. Luke Carver stood at the edge of the field, leaning against a fence post, watching them. The days since the winter storm had passed in a quiet rhythm of work, meals, and small joys. And through it all, Clara had become part of their lives, not just a caretaker, but a presence that felt both steady and vital, like the river running through the valley. Clara emerged from the barn carrying a basket of eggs, dusting straw from her sleeves. Her hair, loosely braided, caught the sunlight, glinting like chestnut. Her dress was simple, yet it clung to her with quiet dignity, worn from work, but unbroken in spirit. Luke felt his chest tighten. He had seen courage in her, loyalty and kindness, but in this moment there was something more. She belonged here. Not just with the girls, not just in his home, but in the very rhythm of his life. From the wagon by the fence, the twins waved, calling out to her. "Mama, look!" Lila shouted. "We found a bird's nest!" Clara smiled and crouched down beside them, pointing to the delicate nest tucked in the crook of a small tree. Luke's heart softened further at the sight. The girl's joy was mirrored in her eyes, pure and unrestrained. The sound of hooves drew his attention. Sheriff Clay Hargrove rode into the yard, tipping his hat in greeting. He dismounted, dusting snow from his boots, a leftover habit from winter, though unnecessary now. "Well, I'll be," the sheriff said, voice filled with amusement. "Seems you've managed to pull it off, Carver. The girls are happy, and you look less like a man starved for company and more like a family man." Luke grinned faintly. "Couldn't have done it without their help." Clay glanced toward Clara, who stood brushing hay from the twins' hair. A slow smile spread across his face. "And I suppose she's the reason for all this peace, eh?" Luke's gaze lingered on her. The words didn't need to be spoken. They hung between them, stronger than any declaration. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "I take it they've chosen wisely?" The twins' voices carried across the yard before anyone could answer. "Papa, that's her! That's our mama!" Luke turned to Clara, seeing her now as more than a caretaker or a friend. The girls had spoken the truth. They had chosen her, and in doing so, had given him the clarity he'd been avoiding for so long. Clara's cheeks flushed, a soft warmth spreading through her as the girls ran to her again, wrapping their arms around her waist. She looked up at Luke, uncertainty lingering for a heartbeat, then smiled, quiet and genuine. He stepped forward, taking her hand. "They were right," he said, voice steady. "You belong here, with us." Her eyes met his, and for the first time she allowed herself to accept it fully. Not as a favor, not as charity, but as a place in a family that had already chosen her heart. The sheriff chuckled, tipping his hat again. "Guess I'll let you two have your quiet little miracle then." Luke pulled Clara closer, the girls squealing and laughing between them. The wind carried their joy across the fields, blending with the songs of the springtime. For the first time since Mary's death, the Carver Ranch felt whole, full of love, laughter, and belonging. The twins, nestled between them, whispered once more, tiny voices full of certainty. "That's her. That's our mama." And in that moment, with the sun casting long golden shadows across the pasture and the promise of new beginnings in every corner, Luke, Clara, and the girls became a family. Not by chance, not by convenience, but by choice, courage, and the quiet, unshakable bonds of the heart. For Luke, the grief of the past had finally made room for hope. For Clara, the pain of her journey had led her to a home worth staying for. And for Lila and Rose, their whispered truth had become reality. The woman they had claimed as Mama had been theirs all along. The ranch breathed with them, alive, warm, and finally complete.